Today we're going to be reviewing the Evangelical Study Bible by Thomas Nelson Publishers. And as usual, before we jump into the specifics, if you haven't already, hit that little subscribe button. That really helps this channel grow. In fact, this Bible that we're going to be looking at is one of the ones that I'm going to be giving away once we hit 20,000 subscribers. I have a whole stack over there off to my right of Bibles that I've been reviewing. And I don't keep most of the Bibles that we look at here on the channel. I give them away to viewers or people I know that need Bibles. So once we hit 20,000, we're going to do a big giveaway, and we're just going to give away a ton of these that we've reviewed here on the channel. But we also do giveaways, not just here on the channel, but also over on Instagram. So if you're not following us at Disciple Dojo's Instagram account, hop over there and follow us as well, because I do giveaways on that from time to time too. Okay, with that being said, let's look at the Evangelical Study Bible. Now, outwardly, this is a very good-looking, well-put-together Bible. It comes with this dust jacket, which we're going to take off, and underneath, it looks identical. It's got a nice green ribbon bookmark, and it's a full-color Bible. It's double-columned, it's a red letter edition, and it also has center column references. Now, the general editor for this was Edward Henson, who recently passed away. He was a longtime faculty member at Liberty University, and it's billed as being Christ-centered, faith-building, and mission-focused. So let's open it up and see what you're going to find between the covers. You're going to have a nice presentation page, and then there's a foreword by Edward Henson that talks about how this Bible came about. In 1985, Jerry Falwell commissioned a team at Liberty University to begin writing study notes for the King James Study Bible. And then in 2020, Henson was asked to get a new team of scholars to revise, expand, and improve the original notes for a new study Bible based on the New King James Version to be called the Evangelical Study Bible. And so they say, it has been our desire to produce faith-affirming study notes that represent the finest conservative Christian scholarship. Then there's a note to the reader that sort of talks about the different types of study notes that you're going to find. And then you have a list of contributing editors. There we go. Had to bump the lighting up on the new overhead camera that we have. If you notice, you can actually read the words now. It's because we're not just using a donated GoPro anymore. Thanks to those of you who support this ministry, we've actually been able to get a semi-decent overhead camera. So that's why you're able to see my face while you're also seeing this shot as well. So let's jump back into it. You got a table of contents, book list, abbreviations, all standard stuff. Now you're going to have a section on how to use the Evangelical Study Bible. So if they have this Trinity symbol in a kind of grayish green box like this, these are going to be notes having to do with doctrine. Then there are going to be personality profile notes. If the symbol is the shovel, these are going to be archaeological based notes. If the symbol is a key, these are going to be apologetics based notes. They're going to be a lot of in-text maps, and they're all in full color. And then there's a page, and this is pretty helpful, that tells you what the different notes you're going to find within that center cross-reference column, what those are. Next, you're going to come to an essay about the Bible, very basic, very general overview. Then an essay on how to study the Bible. And I really like what they said in this paragraph here. It says, second, know that you do not have to study the Bible alone. Actually, it's best not to. Before you begin to study the Bible, pray that the Holy Spirit will give you understanding. Remember that God wants you to understand the Bible, and He will help you do just that. There are also various tools such as commentaries and concordances to help you study. Because you're learning to study the Bible yourself, you shouldn't rely too heavily on commentaries to explain passages to you, but don't neglect these helpful tools either. A good approach is to read a portion of Scripture and work through it, trying to understand it on your own. Then consult other resources to answer any lingering questions you might have and to confirm or correct what you discovered. And I think that's just really good advice. Too many people fall into the trap, and I know they do because I see the comments here on YouTube. Oh, I don't need any other commentaries. I don't need the teachings of man. I just have the Holy Spirit. Jesus just tells me what it means. That sounds real spiritual, but it's actually super prideful. God forbid you actually need help understanding Scripture from people who God has called to teach and expound upon Scripture. There's no such thing as Lone Ranger Christians. And we all of us, from beginning Bible readers to the most seasoned Bible interpreters, we need the body. We need our ideas being shared with other members of Christ's body And that correction and that rebuke and that reproof and that sharpening and that confirmation, it's a communal process. And especially American evangelicalism, which is the tradition I come out of, we've sort of bought into the lie that the best way to study the Bible is to go off by yourself and quietly read it on your own. And that's just not a biblical way of doing discipleship. I like the fact that they say use resources, use commentaries, but don't depend on them. Don't rely on them. Don't treat them as sacrosanct. And they would say that, I'm sure, about even the study notes in this Bible. So helpful opening essay, I actually really appreciated it. Then you have this section called God's Answers to Our Concerns, and it's just an alphabetical list of topics and a couple of Bible verses that deal with those topics. Now we come to the introduction to the Old Testament, which is about a page and a quarter in length, and then we get into the Old Testament itself. So here's Genesis. Now all the pages, like I said, they're all full color, and all the book intros have these large images at the beginning of each book. After Revelation, there's a topical index to Christ and the Gospels. So things that you're going to find specifically in the Gospels, sayings of Jesus, parables. Then you come to the table of weights and measures, and they do have a helpful explanation about why a table of weights and measures is important. And they even give sort of modern monetary equivalents to the ancient measurings. At the rate of inflation, this will probably be outdated within the next 6 months, but there you go. And they do the same with weights and with length and dry measures. And so if you want to know miles or feet, they let you know what's going on. Then there's an overview of the Jewish calendar. There's a page that has prayers in the Bible. Then you have about a 150 or so page concordance, not exhaustive, but extensive. And then at last we come to the Thomas Nelson glossy maps that you find in most Thomas Nelson study Bibles. Now, this is from a very conservative evangelical tradition, and so they are going to argue extensively for Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. They won't take the position that Moses wrote every word. They do allow that Moses didn't write about, say, his death. They allow in the notes for some later updating of place names or insertions, but for the most part, they argue that the Pentateuch was a unified work authored by Moses in the 15th century BCE. So then you come to an outline of the book, and then Genesis 1 begins. Unsurprisingly, this is produced by Liberty University, so you are going to get young earth creationism. They will acknowledge that old earth creationism exists. They will acknowledge that there are people who are theistic evolutionists, but the notes come from a very unapologetically young earth creationist approach. That being said, they do get into the literary and even the ancient Near East background of the text, and they do a decent job of it. For instance, this study note here, Genesis 1, about the creation 6 days, even though they take the days as a literal 24-hour days, they also note the symmetry, the pattern of 3 days of God forming and then 3 days of God filling, and how those correspond to one another. Now, they also note that the Hebrew word yom can have different meanings, and it even has different meanings the first verse where it's used. It's used in 2 different ways. But then they conclude, while yom does display a range of meanings in the Old Testament, the formula of, quote, evening and morning, the blank day, does not support reading yom as anything but an ordinary day. But then when it comes to the rakia, the dome, the firmament placed over the earth, they take a more phenomenological approach. So they say, given that the sun, moon, and stars are placed within the firmament and birds fly across it, it seems unlikely that the firmament is a solid material. Thus, expanse or sky is preferable. So they're talking about how King James uses this term firmament, which literally means a solid dome, but that's not literally what's going on. That's just referring to the sky. Now, for more on the creation days, we have a whole playlist here on the channel. Check it out. We go through day by day, looking at the language, doing a deep dive on each day of creation. And we also specifically talk about this term, the rakiach, and what that means. I've written an article over on the Logos website that you can check out. I'll link it in the video description below. Now, there are some theological doctrinal articles here on creation of humans, the image and the likeness of God, the Adamic covenant, creation care, and the dominion mandate. They're not in depth. They're not very long, but they give you an idea of this is where these doctrines doctrines come from. When it comes to the historicity of Adam, they mention different views like old earth creationists and evolutionary creationists, but then they say that their proposals are problematic and that the view, young earth creationist, preserves the unity of humanity within the first couple, expands its membership, and maintains orthodox views on vital Christian doctrines. So they do acknowledge other views exist, but they present the young earth creationist view as really the only faithful option. Now, when we come to the notes on Genesis 6, the sons of God, the notes here do a good job of presenting the three different views. There's a bit of reticence. They aren't dogmatic on a particular position when it comes to what is, I would say, the most enigmatic chapter literally in the entire Bible. When we come to the flood, there's a good note that says the destruction that God will unleash is ultimately an act of decreation, and the flood narrative continuously borrows terms and imagery from Genesis 1 through 3. This is a good insight, great observation. And then when it comes to looking at other ancient Near East flood accounts that seem to be similar to the Genesis account, like the Atrahasis epic or the Enuma Elish, they note the similarities. And their conclusion is actually the opposite from what maybe more liberal scholars would conclude, that scripture borrowed from other more ancient works. They say these similarities are sufficient to establish these accounts as pointing back to the original flood of Noah's time. And so Genesis preserves what you might call the real version, whereas the other ancient accounts were their attempts at explaining it based on their religious views, their pantheon of gods, their view of the world. Then there's a note about the flood and the fossil record. And this is basically a note that just says, old earth creationists and evolutionary creationists presuppose that there was animal death before the fall, but young earth creationism says that death, even in the animal world, entered as a result of the fall. And so how you view that issue will determine how you view modern science and the fossil record and how you attempt to reconcile Genesis and science. Then at the end of the story, there's a doctrinal note on the Noahic covenant. And when talking about the rainbow, they note that the term bow, Kesheth, is used for both the warrior's bow and the rainbow. In the ancient world, gods were often depicted with bows to show their military prowess and ability to punish people or other gods. In contrast, the one true God positions his bow not at earth, but heavenward as a symbol of peace. And this is concise, but this is a good note. That is the background of the rainbow in Genesis. For more on that, see the video that we've done here on the channel in our Bible Backgrounds playlist. This is a good and helpful, concise way of putting it. They also have notes on the infamous Curse of Ham passage, and they talk about how this has been misused to justify chattel slavery, race-based slavery. And they say this gross misreading both ignores the fact that Canaan and his descendants were not African and rejects the dignity of African peoples as image bearers of God. So strongly repudiating older views in previous centuries that people sought to try to justify the slave trade by appealing to Genesis and the curse that Noah gives to Ham's son Canaan. So now when we come to Exodus, I like this phrase that was here right at the beginning. It says the first half of the book focuses on why Israel should worship the Lord, for example, his deliverance, while the second half focuses on how Israel should worship the Lord, for example, the law and the tabernacle instructions. That's a pretty good way to divide up mentally the book of Exodus in your mind. First half is God's deliverance, his grace, and then the second half is his stipulations. Now that you are my people, here's how you're going to live as my covenant people. Then when they get into the historical setting, they note that even evangelicals disagree on the date of the Exodus. Some say it's in the 15th century BC, some say it's in the 13th century BC. They acknowledge the disagreement, but then they say basically why they take the older view, the 15th century view. They give all the reasoning for that view. They don't give any of the counter reasons for the 13th century view. I feel like they should have done that since they acknowledge that other evangelicals hold to that view as well, even if they ultimately don't land there. Now, when it comes to the plagues, they do say many plagues seem to be directed against specific Egyptian deities, which I do believe is correct. And they give an example down here with the plague of frogs and how that's been considered an attack against the goddess Heket, the spouse of Khnum, who is depicted in the form of a woman with a frog's head. And they also give some background on the concept of Pharaoh's heart and what God hardening his heart consisted of. It's not a lot. This is not as much as you're going to find in, say, the Cultural Background Study Bible, but they do use the very same image. And as short as this note is, it was actually pretty good. We've done a video on that exact issue here on the channel. You can check that out if you want to go deeper into this question. But overall, these notes do a good job of putting the text of Exodus in its Egyptian context. Now, when it comes to the location of the Red Sea, they give a few of the different views. They don't really give any mention of the Gulf of Aqaba crossing point, but they do mention Suez or the Bitter Lakes, or maybe somewhere in the northern Delta region. They don't take a hard and fast position on it, but they generally consider the Sinai Peninsula and the traditional location of Mount Sinai being here, rather than the alternate location being over in Saudi Arabia, which is also something we've talked about in that same Bible Backgrounds playlist that I mentioned earlier. There's a good note at Exodus 19 about how Exodus fits suzerainty treaties, particularly Hittite suzerainty treaties from the second millennium. They lay out the different parts of a Hittite suzerainty treaty and they show the biblical equivalent. In these later chapters of Exodus, you have illustrations of the tabernacle, the implements of the tabernacle. Now, I wanted to see how this Bible handled something in particular, and that is the numbers. Usually that's touched on in the notes when Israel comes out of Egypt, and it first gives like that count of Israel's fighting men that came out, and it's, over 600,000. I didn't find any study notes on that in Exodus, but in Numbers, they do touch on it. Numbers 146. They note the reasons that some interpreters don't take the numbers literally, and they basically give three different approaches that interpreters have taken. That the numbers are either symbolic or hyperbolic, sort of inflated rhetorically, that the number Aleph should be translated as regiment or clan or something like that, and it's just referring to 600 groups of fighting men, or that they're just literal numbers and we have to deal with it. And they say at the end, the latter two seem to be the best approaches. If you saw our interview here on the channel with Dr. Jay Sklar and his recent numbers commentary, we actually talked about this issue. Jay takes something close to the first view, and he is thoroughly evangelical. So it's good to see them acknowledging the different approaches. Now, after the Old Testament, there are a couple of essays between the Old and the New Testament. There's one called Between the Testaments, and it just sort of lays out the general events that happened during the periods in Israel's history. Period of Persian rule, the period of Greek rule, the period of Jewish independence, and then the period of Roman rule. Then there's an essay on the sects within Judaism, the different Jewish sects. And they give this spectrum here where you have anti-Rome groups, and the Zealots would be the most extreme example. And then you have the pro-Rome groups and the Herodians, those who are in power and in cahoots with Rome, and then everybody in between. Now, this is really helpful because you're going to see these groups mentioned in the New Testament. And sometimes they all just get lumped together in our heads as, oh, they're all pretty much the same. No, they were very different. And the landscape of ancient Judaism was just as varied as the landscape of modern Judaism. So then you have a chronology of the intertestamental events. Then you come to a harmony of the Gospels. So they give a date, they give the event in Jesus' life, where it took place, and then where it appears in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then other references elsewhere in Scripture that touch on those events. And so it's about 6 pages long. Then after that, an introduction to the New Testament. And then you turn the page, and we're in Matthew. There's a lot of full-color illustrations, a lot of photographs, maps, even a nice kind of rendered 3D map there of Galilee region. And everything is laid out pretty clear, pretty easy to use. Now, when we come to Romans, the intro to Romans, this is a good intro, I gotta say. They talk about the background of Romans and how one of the main points of tension that Paul was addressing at the church at Rome was the conflict between Jewish followers of Jesus and Gentile followers of Jesus, and how they were to be one body, even when they had different convictions on a number of things. And I'll zoom in here on this overview of Romans. I think this is a great, succinct summary of the book. It says, purpose and major themes. From his epistle, we learn that Paul wrote in order to introduce himself to the church in Rome and to prepare them for his intended visit. In addition, he sought to address conflicts that had begun to form, many of which were the result of Jewish and Gentile divisions. His treatment of the doctrine of salvation, chapters 1 through 8, the status of Israel and the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, chapters 9 through 11, and his practical instructions, chapters 12 through 16, provided his readers with an overview of the message he proclaimed and theological insight that related to their current situation and relationship to one another. That's a pretty good, albeit very succinct, overview of Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, when we come to Romans 7, they say this is one of the most controversial passages in Paul's epistles. Some have suggested that Paul was speaking about his life before he knew Christ, given his emphatic assertion in the previous chapter that sin does not have dominion over the believer. It's perhaps more likely, however, that he is referring to his present state as a believer in Christ who is no longer a slave to sin, but continues to struggle against his sinful nature. Understood in this light, the passage provides a vivid description of the spiritual battle that confronts each believer. This is in line with a typical Augustinian, Lutheran, Reformed view of Romans 7, but they do leave out that there is a third view that Paul's not talking about himself before his conversion. He's speaking of humanity collectively as those who are in Adam. We've dealt with that here on the channel if you're interested in some of the background on this passage, but to their credit, they do note that there are different ways of reading this passage rather than just skipping over it completely like some study Bibles do. When we come to Romans 9, they say that foreknowledge refers specifically to certain individuals that God determined before eternity to bring into a saving relationship with himself. So they are reading the predestination section of Romans 9 as speaking of individual election rather than corporate election. But they do note, to their credit, regarding the famous Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated, that is not talking about the individuals Jacob and Esau, but in its context in Malachi, it's referring to nations of Israel and Edom, not to individuals. And then similarly here, in Romans 11, when it talks about his people whom he foreknew, they say it is important to note that Paul was addressing national rather than individual destiny. So they don't take this approach in Romans 9. They do take it in Romans 11. But speaking of Romans 11, you're going to find the view that Paul is talking about when it says, and so all Israel will be saved, that it's talking about a future event that's going to happen in conjunction with the millennial reign of Jesus. And they say Paul anticipates worldwide millennial blessing and the outpouring of salvation. And so all Israel will be saved. Paul's usage demonstrates that ethnic Israel is in view. Finally, the reference to all Israel has been understood by some to refer to each and every individual of Jewish descent. It would seem more likely, however, that Paul used the term in a more general sense of a future national conversion of Israel. So there's no discussion of the whole olive tree, Jew and Gentile together being what Paul refers to as all Israel, but that Israel specifically is only referring to ethnically Jewish people. And there's going to be a national conversion at some point in the future before the return of Jesus. It's a very standard premillennial understanding of Romans chapter 11. Now, knowing this is a study Bible done largely by faculty associated with Liberty University, I assume that you're going to get premillennialism. I assume you're going to get young earth creationism. And I assumed you're going to get complementarianism. But you don't want to assume. You want to look and see. And so I wanted to see how they treat the issue of complementarianism and the roles of women. And so there are typically three passages where this really stands out in a study Bible. You have 1 Corinthians 14, you have Ephesians, and you have 1 Timothy. Well, in 1 Corinthians 14, the women should remain silent in church. I do not permit a woman to speak. The note there says, Paul's instruction in these verses may suggest that there were some women who were interrupting the gathering or becoming a distraction by asking questions or speaking at inappropriate times. While the specific situation that Paul was referring to is difficult to ascertain with certainty, it's clear that his concern was to establish guidelines that would ensure that, quote, all things be done decently and in order. So they don't take Paul's admonition in 1 Corinthians 14 as a blanket prohibition that women aren't allowed to speak or have any role in teaching in the church in this passage. But when you come to Ephesians chapter 5, the notes are pretty unambiguously complementarian. Paul calls upon wives to submit to their husbands as an act of obedience to Christ. When the wife yields her will to that of her husband, she ultimately yields to the Lord, provided the husband's directions are in fear of God and in line with God's will. So they put that caveat in there that a woman should submit, but only as long as the man's directions are in accordance with God. Because 523, just as Jesus is the divinely appointed head of or authority over his church, the husband is the divinely appointed head of or authority over his wife. As Jesus provides for the welfare of his church, the husband is responsible to protect and care for his wife. Verse 24, Paul clarifies that the wife's submission to her husband is to be in everything. And then they put the caveat again. That is, in every area of life that may arise, so long as the husband remains in the fear of God. So even a complementarian reading of the passage has to add in caveats or put some nuance in there. And I only mention this because a lot of times people just say, well, it's just the plain reading of the text. There's no such thing as the plain reading of the text. Every interpretation has to read something into the text somewhere in some way. And this is an example of how complementarianism has to do that. And then lastly, the other most significant passage that has to do with the complementarian debate is 1 Timothy chapter 2, where Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And they say the passage by no means prohibits women from all forms of teaching. In fact, Paul instructs godly women to teach other women in Titus 2, 3-5. Just as God has called men to provide spiritual oversight of the home, so too he has called godly men to lead the local church. So women can teach, just not men, and they can't lead the local church. But unsurprisingly, again, this is a product of people associated with Liberty University, a very complementarian, conservative Christian institution. So this should surprise absolutely no one. Now, the notes in Romans weren't super Calvinistic. They kind of leaned that way. But the note in Ephesians 1 is straight up Calvinistic. And they say, Ephesians 1, predestined. Prior to creation, God appointed those who would later believe to become his sons. This divine appointment was for the good pleasure of his will. It was not the result of anything good or meritorious in those who were appointed, but was solely the result of his grace and kindness. These verses clearly emphasize the divine sovereignty of God in salvation, while many other passages, verses 12 and 13 included, emphasize our responsibility to exercise faith. So they don't really try to show how those two things fit together. They just say predestination is individuals being elected to salvation. But elsewhere in the Bible, people are held accountable. So there you go. They don't get into double predestination, supralapsarianism, any of that kind of stuff that more theoretical, systematic Calvinist approaches to theology have tried to fill in the blanks with. They just sort of say, this is what it is. And then lastly, we come to Revelation. The intro begins by noting that Revelation is apocalyptic, but then they make a weird claim. Revelation is apocalyptic in form. That is, it contains prophetic material that focuses primarily upon future events tied to the Lord's return and the future state. That's not the definition of apocalyptic. Apocalyptic isn't always about future or end time stuff. Apocalyptic is just revealing what's going on now and what's going to unfold, but doing so through visions presented using symbolic imagery and all that kind of stuff. They're sort of slipping in a futurist reading at the very beginning. Now, when you get into interpreting Revelation, they note the four different views. And this was a good overview. They note that there are idealist approaches to Revelation. They note that there are preterist approaches to Revelation, historicist approaches to Revelation, and futurist approaches to Revelation. They leave out the fifth one, which is the eclectic view that recognizes some truth in each of those, but they land in a futurist reading of Revelation. And you see that very clearly at the end of chapter 3, when they're talking about the last verse that Jesus says to Laodicea. And it says, verse 22 contains the last reference to the church before chapter 22. That's the end of the book, implying that the rapture will occur before the events of chapters 4 through 19, and thus that the church will not be present on earth during the Great Tribulation. So they take Revelation 4 when John sees a door and the angel says, come up here and see what's going to take place, that is, the church is raptured out of the world. And all the events of Revelation are end times events that are going to start after the rapture. Now, they do give some good historical background. There's a great note on Laodicea, which is one of the case studies we look at in our Bible reviews. They note the water supply at Laodicea and how they had to get their hot water from Hierapolis and their cold water from Colossae, but that the water at Laodicea wasn't really useful because it wasn't hot or cold, and how that's what Jesus was describing the church as. Really good background note. And there's even a picture of ancient Laodicea. And they get into the background of the city considering itself self-sufficient and having a a medical industry that had developed eye salve and being rich with gold and fine, luxurious clothing. This is a good presentation of the background of the church at Laodicea. So I do want to emphasize that and give credit where it's due. But the rest of Revelation, you're getting dispensational premillennialism. And so in Revelation 20, when we come to the millennium, the question arises, in this millennium that Revelation 20 is talking about, if Jesus is ruling, how is there a final rebellion of sin? In other words, if the millennium is this utopia and everybody in it is saved, where does Satan's final rebellion come from? Who does he recruit at the end of the millennium to oppose God's people? So the solution that they offer, chapter 20, verse 7 through 10, many of the believers who enter the millennium as survivors of the tribulation will possess non-resurrected natural bodies and have children who will also reproduce throughout the 1,000 years. Many of the descendants will remain unsaved and unregenerate and will therefore be able to sin. At the end of the millennium, Satan will be released from prison to make one last attempt to deceive the nations into rebellion against God. The reference to Gog and Magog shows that this final battle will be similar to the invasion described in Ezekiel 38. The beloved city is likely a reference to the earthly Jerusalem, the center of Christ's millennial kingdom. So I didn't want to assume, but I am in no way surprised that this study Bible is operating strictly from a dispensational premillennial view. So that is the Evangelical Study Bible. Would I recommend this study Bible? Let me talk strengths and weaknesses. This is a beautifully laid out Bible. The design is great. The page layout is very clear. Full color pages are nice. It's easy to see everything. I like that there are articles that go beyond just study articles. They do have some apologetics focused articles. They have some doctrinal articles. Now, obviously, if you are from another theological tradition, those will be significantly less useful. But for the most part, they stay pretty general, pretty orthodox evangelical Christianity. But the cons are this is too narrow to be called a truly evangelical study Bible. This should have been called the Liberty University Study Bible. It's Calvinist. Well, there are numerous evangelicals outside of Calvinism. It's complementarian. There are tons of evangelicals who are not complementarian. It's premillennial dispensational. That's actually the newest eschatological view in church history. So I would put this like I'd put some of the mainline study Bibles out there, or like the Lutheran study Bible that we just reviewed. You know, if you want to know what complementarian, Calvinist, conservative, the three C's, evangelical view, then yeah, you'll get that in this study Bible. So for that reason, it might be helpful. But I just think there are better study Bibles out there that do a better job representing true evangelicalism than this one. So at the end of the day, that's my critique, honestly. It's as an evangelical, lifelong card-carrying evangelical who falls outside of a number of the theological conclusions that the contributors of this come to, I don't feel like I'm reading something by my tribe when I'm reading this, which is fine. You know, we should read outside of our tradition, but I think the label, the Evangelical Study Bible, what frustrates me about this is what's frustrated me about pretty much American culture for the past however many number of years. I don't know when you're watching this video. Evangelicalism has been narrowly defined with a specific subset of political conservatism focused around places like Liberty University. But that's not evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is a much broader big tent term. So I think this contributes to the misuse of the term evangelical, and that's my biggest gripe with it. If this was called the Liberty Study Bible or the Reformed Baptist Study Bible or something else other than the Evangelical Study Bible, I would have been far less disappointed with it than I am. But as an evangelical, I just don't resonate with so much of what I'm reading in this. But don't hear me bashing this and saying that it's all bad. There is good material in this. I think it can be useful. I just think you would need a severe disclaimer. You need to know you're getting a very specific form of eschatology that no one believed before the mid-1800s. You need to know you're getting Calvinism, or at least leaning to Calvinism. And if you're a Calvinist, that'll be great. You'll see that as a strength. If you're not, then just be aware. And you need to know you're going to be getting complementarianism. Again, if you're a complementarian, you'll see that as a strength. If you're not, Just be aware. So my personal bias, I don't want that to overshadow this. If this is your type of evangelicalism, you'll probably love this. I just don't want people to equate this with what evangelicals believe, full stop, because it's not. So those are my thoughts. I would love to hear yours. Let me know. Was I fair in this review? Was I too harsh? Was I too biased? Was I not biased enough? Does this make you want to buy this Bible? Does this make you want to stay away from this Bible? Disciple Dojo is a ministry open to the broad spectrum of evangelicalism and even beyond. So just let me know what you think. I love hearing comments, respectful comments, substantive comments. Share your thoughts if you've looked at the Evangelical Study Bible so far. Maybe I missed something. Maybe there's something in here that you're like, why didn't you cover that? It's so important. Tell me what it is. I'd love to know. Thanks for watching. Thank you to those of you that are subscribed. Again, when we hit 20,000 subscribers, we're going to do a big Bible giveaway. I may even try to do it live stream. We've never done any live stream here at the dojo because I'm just not tech savvy enough to pull all the levers and do everything all at once. But you never know. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe, click the notifications icon so you won't miss it. And speaking of missing it, when we do giveaways, follow the channel. Because when I announce the winners, there have been the past 2 contests, I've still got resources that people won that they never claimed. So I always post the winners here on YouTube in the feed, and I post it on Instagram. So go subscribe on Instagram if you haven't already. If you win something, I want to get it to you, but I can't get it to you if you don't claim your prize. So anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time back here at Disciple Dojo with more study Bible reviews. In the meantime, and as always, keep training.